For decades, the anchor chair was one of the most stable jobs in American media. You showed up, you read the news, and people trusted your face more than they trusted most of the people actually making headlines. Then, over the last 2 decades, that stability started cracking. Contracts got torn up overnight. Careers that took 30 years to build ended in a single afternoon. And what happened to these anchors after the cameras stopped rolling tells you almost as much about the news business as anything they ever reported. This is the story of 5 anchors who lost the biggest platforms of their careers, and the very different paths each of them took afterward. Some rebuilt bigger than before. Some are still fighting in courtrooms years later. One never got the chance to come back at all. Dan Rather spent more than 3 decades as one of the most recognized faces in American journalism. He anchored the CBS Evening News for 24 years starting in 1981, taking over from Walter Cronkite and becoming, alongside Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw, one of the so-called Big Three nightly news anchors who essentially defined how tens of millions of Americans understood the world each night. Then came September of 2004. 6 weeks before a presidential election, Rather presented documents on 60 Minutes 2 suggesting President George W. Bush had received favorable treatment during his service in the Texas Air National Guard. Site index equals 3-1, Rather stated on air that the documents had been taken from Lieutenant Colonel Killian's personal files and asserted they had been authenticated by experts retained by CBS/site within hours. Bloggers and typography experts were picking the documents apart, pointing to fonts and formatting that did not exist on 1970s-era typewriters. CBS defended the story for nearly 2 weeks before the network's position collapsed entirely. Site index equals 3-1. On September 20, 2004, CBS retracted the story, and Rather said that if he had known then what he knew at that point, he would not have gone ahead with the report or used the documents in question. Site, an independent panel commissioned by CBS later concluded the network's reporting process had been deeply flawed, and site index equals 3-1. CBS dismissed the story's producer and asked 3 other producers connected to it to resign. Site. Rather did not lose his job immediately. But site index equals 3-1. Many observers believe the incident hastened his retirement from the anchor desk/site. And site index equals 3-1. He continued working with CBS only until 2006, when the network dismissed him entirely. Site, he didn't go quietly. Site index equals 3-1. In September 2007, Rather filed a $70 million lawsuit against CBS and its former parent company, accusing the network of making him a scapegoat for the story. Site, the lawsuit didn't succeed. Site index equals 3-1. An appeals court dismissed it in 2009, and New York's highest court declined to revive it in 2010. Site. 4 years, Rather worked at the margins of the industry he had once dominated. Site index equals 3-1. He hosted an investigative program called Dan Rather Reports on the cable channel AXS TV from 2006 to 2013/site. Along with other long-form projects for the same network, doing legitimate journalism but for an audience a fraction of the size of the one he'd had at CBS. What makes his story unusual is what happened decades later. In 2024, CBS Sunday Morning brought Rather back for a televised profile. Site index equals 10-1, his first appearance on CBS since being fired 18 years earlier. Site, he reflected on his decades at the network without bitterness, saying simply that he'd given CBS everything he had. It was a quiet coda to one of the most infamous scandals in broadcast history. Not vindication exactly, but a kind of institutional forgiveness that few disgraced anchors ever receive. Rather, now in his 90s, remains active on social media and continues to comment on the news, still recognized as one of the defining voices of 20th century American journalism, even if the mistake that ended his network career will always be part of how that legacy is told. If there was one anchor who seemed genuinely untouchable in cable news, it was Tucker Carlson. By the early 2020s, his 8 p.m. hour on Fox News was the highest-rated program in the country, and Carlson had become arguably the single most influential voice in conservative media. Then, in April 2023, Fox ended it in a 4-sentence statement. The timing mattered enormously. Site index equals 27-1. The announcement came just days after Fox News agreed to pay nearly $787 million to settle a defamation lawsuit brought by Dominion Voting Systems over false claims about the 2020 election. Site Carlson had been a central figure in that case. Site index equals 29-1. Evidence disclosed during the litigation revealed private text messages in which Carlson expressed views privately that were even more extreme than what he said on air, including a disturbing message about violence that alarmed Fox's leadership and reportedly convinced network executives he had become more of a liability than an asset. Site index equals 26-1. Fox said simply that it and Carlson had agreed to part ways, thanking him for his service, and confirmed his final broadcast had aired the previous Friday. Site Carlson himself had given no on-air indication anything was wrong. Site index equals 26-1. He'd ended that final Friday show by cheerfully telling viewers he'd see them Monday. Site. He never got the chance. What happened next separates Carlson from almost everyone else on this list. Rather than fading out, he built his own independent media operation almost immediately. Site index equals 28-1. He started his own company and launched a YouTube channel that has grown to nearly 4 million subscribers, where he now publishes multiple interviews every week. Site, with a genuinely eclectic list of guests, from foreign heads of state to controversial financial figures to actors. Site index equals 28-1. Carlson has said he no longer consumes conventional news content at all, preferring to get information directly from the people he interviews, and that losing the Fox job was simply the price of saying things a corporate employer didn't want said. Site. The strange twist, 3 years on, is that neither side clearly lost. Fox recovered its ratings dominance under Carlson's replacement, Jesse Waters, and has continued to post strong numbers. Site index equals 25-1. Meanwhile, polling shows Carlson's own favorability has slipped substantially even among Republicans, with a significant share now viewing him unfavorably or expressing no opinion of him at all, a strange outcome for someone once considered indispensable to the conservative media ecosystem. Site Carlson didn't vanish in any literal sense. If anything, he built a bigger, more unfiltered platform than the one he lost. But the aura of inevitability that surrounded him at Fox, the idea that no network could survive losing him, turned out to be far less durable than anyone predicted at the time. Don Lemon's fall from CNN happened in stages, each one messier than the last. He joined the network in 2006 and spent nearly 2 decades there, eventually anchoring his own primetime hour, Don Lemon Tonight, before moving to a co-hosting role on the network's morning show. The unraveling began with a single on-air comment. Site index equals 22-1. In February 2023, discussing a suggestion that older presidential candidates should face mental competency tests, Lemon remarked that Republican candidate Nikki Haley, then 51, was no longer in her prime, saying a woman is considered to be in her prime in her 20s, 30s, and maybe her 40s. Site. The comment triggered swift backlash, and site index equals 22-1. Lemon agreed to undergo training after the network faced public criticism over the remarks. Site. Then came a more serious problem. Site index equals 22-1. In April 2023, Variety published a report, based on more than a dozen current and former colleagues, describing a long pattern of behavior in which Lemon was allegedly hostile toward women at the network. Site. Lemon's team disputed the reporting. Weeks later, site index equals 22-1, CNN terminated him, with Lemon saying he learned of it through his agent and that no one at the network had the decency to tell him directly, a characterization CNN publicly disputed. Site index equals 20-1. The firing happened, coincidentally, on the very same day Fox News parted ways with Tucker Carlson. Site. A twist of scheduling that turned one Monday in April 2023 into one of the most dramatic days in the history of American cable news. Lemon's post-CNN path has been unusually turbulent even by the standards of this list. Site index equals 20-1. He announced a new interview show on X, with Elon Musk booked as the very first guest, but Musk abruptly canceled the partnership after filming the interview and before it aired. Site. Reportedly displeased with how the conversation went. The interview eventually surfaced independently on YouTube instead. Lemon later sued Musk over the collapsed deal. More recently, Lemon's story has taken an even stranger turn, moving from media controversy into actual criminal courts. Site index equals 20-1. In January 2026, federal authorities arrested Lemon in connection with his coverage of a protest at a Minnesota church tied to opposition against ICE enforcement/site, and site index equals 24-1. He was later released on bond and pleaded not guilty to the resulting federal charges/site. He has continued building an independent media career throughout. Site index equals 20-1. His self-produced show now operates with roughly 1.25 million YouTube subscribers/site, but his name now surfaces in headlines almost as often for legal jeopardy as for journalism. It's a trajectory that looks nothing like the tidy redemption arcs or clean disappearances of other anchors on this list. Lemon's post-firing life has been defined by unpredictability rather than either comeback or retreat. Few firings in television news history happened as fast, or as publicly, as Chris Cuomo's. He had spent years building CNN's highest-rated primetime hour, having arrived at the network in 2013 after stints at ABC News and Good Morning America. His brother, Andrew Cuomo, was governor of New York and a genuine national figure during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, a period when Chris Cuomo's on-air interviews with his brother had drawn both huge ratings and real ethical questions, given a standing network policy against such interviews that had existed since 2013. Those questions became unavoidable once sexual harassment allegations against Andrew Cuomo surfaced. Site index equals 16-1. CNN first benched Chris Cuomo after learning how closely he had been involved in helping his brother strategize a response to the harassment claims/site, then a separate allegation emerged from Cuomo's own past at ABC News. Site index equals 16-1. A former colleague accused him of sexual assault during his time there, which he denied, and CNN said that once the new allegation came to light, it saw no reason to delay taking action/site index equals 12-1. CNN fired him in December 2021/site. Cuomo did not go quietly, either. Site index equals 14-1. He initiated a $125 million arbitration claim against CNN, alleging the network had rushed to judgment based on public pressure rather than a fair process/site, and that arbitration has dragged on for years. Site index equals 14-1. As recently as late 2025, a New York appeals court rejected Cuomo's attempt to disqualify the arbitrator overseeing the case, finding no evidence of bias/site, meaning the fight over his firing could stretch into a fifth year. Unlike several others on this list, though, Cuomo's television career didn't actually end. Site index equals 17-1. He returned to air within about a year, joining NewsNation, a network owned by Nexstar Media that had also recently hired other well-known anchors departing larger networks/site. The show found enough traction that site index equals 19-1. NewsNation signed Cuomo to a multi-year renewal in late 2024 to continue hosting his primetime program/site, and site index equals 13-1. By January 2026, he'd also returned to SiriusXM to host a weekday morning talk show, interviewing guests and taking listener calls/site. He has been candid in interviews about how disorienting the fall was. Site index equals 16-1. Cuomo told podcast host Bill Maher that the scrutiny into his personal life was unlike anything he'd experienced, describing paparazzi following him in numbers he'd never seen directed at anyone in his family before/site. He still says, years later, that he'd rather settle the CNN dispute than keep fighting it, but so far, neither side appears willing to end it. Cuomo's story sits in an interesting middle ground on this list. He wasn't erased from television the way Matt Lauer or Charlie Rose were, and he didn't rebuild an empire the way Tucker Carlson did. He landed at a smaller network, kept working, and is still, years later, locked in an expensive legal fight over a firing he has never fully accepted as fair. Not every story on this list ends with a rebuild, a lawsuit, or even a clear resolution. Lou Dobbs built one of the longest careers in cable news, anchoring CNN's Moneyline starting in 1980 before eventually moving to Fox Business, where his opinionated, immigration-focused program became the network's highest-rated show for nearly a decade. His fall, like Carlson's, was tied directly to the aftermath of the 2020 election. Site index equals 30-1. In February 2021, a voting machine company filed a massive defamation suit against several Fox hosts, including Dobbs, alleging they had promoted conspiracy theories claiming the company had helped rig the election. Site index equals 30-1. Fox News canceled Dobbs's show the very next day. Site and site index equals 30-1. Reporting at the time suggested the decision had actually been under consideration before the lawsuit, with advertisers reportedly unwilling to be associated with the program even though it was the network's highest-rated show. Site. Dobbs never got another mainstream television platform. He spent the next few years mostly out of the spotlight before attempting a modest comeback. Site index equals 32-1. In January 2024, Lou Dobbs Tonight returned as a streaming program on a smaller platform associated with MyPillow founder Mike Lindell. Site. It was a far cry from a nationally distributed cable news hour, reaching a fraction of the audience he'd had at his peak. He never got the chance to build much further. Site index equals 30-1. Dobbs died on July 18, 2024, at the age of 78. Site index equals 31-1. Fox News, the network that had abruptly ended his show 3 years earlier, released a statement calling him an incredible business mind with a gift for broadcasting and thanking him for his contributions. Site, even former President Trump, whom Dobbs had supported unwaveringly on air for years, posted a tribute calling him a friend and an incredible journalist. Dobbs's story is the starkest example on this list of what vanishing can actually mean. He didn't reinvent himself on YouTube. He didn't win a lawsuit or get a network apology tour. He tried briefly to find his way back through a much smaller platform, and then his life ended before that third act could really begin. Of everyone covered here, his disappearance from the mainstream was the most permanent, simply because there was no more time left to reverse it. Line these 5 careers up next to each other and a pattern starts to emerge that has very little to do with talent. Dan Rather made a reporting mistake and was gone from CBS within 2 years, only to be quietly welcomed back nearly 2 decades later once the scandal had faded from public memory. Tucker Carlson lost the platform everyone assumed was unlosable and simply built a new one on his own terms, arguably with less oversight than before. Don Lemon's fall started with a single sentence about a political candidate's age and has since spiraled into federal criminal charges completely unrelated to the original controversy. Chris Cuomo got fired in a single weekend and is still, years later, locked in a courtroom fight over whether that firing was even fair. And Lou Dobbs, who built his entire career around a network that eventually cut him loose over a lawsuit, never lived long enough to find out what a real second act might have looked like. None of these anchors lost their platforms because they lacked skill. Rather was one of the most respected reporters of his generation before one story unraveled him. Carlson was pulling the highest ratings in cable news history. Cuomo anchored CNN's top-performing program. What ended each of their runs was some combination of a single decision, a legal exposure the network wasn't willing to carry, or a private belief revealed too publicly. The lesson, if there is one, isn't really about journalism at all. It's about how thin the line is between being the most valuable person in the building and being the person a network decides it can no longer afford to keep.